Picture this: a queen wrapped in layers of silk and velvet, her every breath choreographed for the sake of appearances. The floor beneath her heels is polished like glass, the chandeliers above her flicker with hundreds of trembling flames. She walks with the posture of power, but beneath the powdered skin, beneath the cinched corset and embroidered gowns, her body whispers truths that no court dare say aloud. Each drop of blood she sheds behind the curtains is not a private inconvenience, it is a political event, dissected by advisors, relayed in diplomatic codes, and sometimes feared more than war itself. This woman, the image of divine authority to her subjects, is imprisoned by a rhythm older than crowns, older than dynasties. Her period is a ledger. It is tracked, inspected, passed from physician to diplomat like a state document. The absence of blood can signal a nation's hope or its collapse. A single missed cycle might mean an heir, or worse, the loss of one. Courtiers watch her complexion, her step, her appetite, hoping to divine what her womb is keeping secret. She cannot flinch, she cannot complain. To be a queen is to be a symbol, not a soul. And yet her body remains defiantly, quietly human. In the gilded courts of 17th and 18th century Europe, menstruation was not a whisper behind closed doors. It was court gossip, it was political weather. In Versailles, in Vienna, in London, the bodies of royal women were effectively nationalized. Their cycles were part of statecraft. When Marie Antoinette experienced a delay in her period early in her marriage, her mother Empress Maria Theresa was immediately informed. Not through whispers, but in writing, via diplomatic letters from ambassadors who reported monthly on the queen's bodily functions. Imagine that, your most intimate experiences becoming official memos, dissected in foreign courts. Monarchs thousands of miles away waited for news about whether blood had appeared. And if it hadn't, what could that mean? The possibility of pregnancy could shift the balance of power, or the absence of pregnancy might cast doubt on a queen's fertility. That doubt wasn't just personal, it was contagious. It could infect treaties, delay coronations, postpone wars. The womb was a vault where dynasties placed all their hopes. And every month, they waited to see if the vault would open or remain closed. But what those letters never described was the daily ordeal. They didn't speak of how a queen, suffering from cramps and bleeding into linen cloths, had to attend hours-long ceremonies without rest, or how she sat on thrones designed for pageantry, not comfort, aware that a single stain could spark rumors of miscarriage. There were no disposable pads, no privacy, no freedom to excuse oneself. Cloth rags were used, folded, and tied around the waist with cotton belts. These had to be changed in secret and frequently. But a queen couldn't excuse herself quietly. Even leaving a room required servants, attendants, guards. Every step was a procession. Changing one's cloth meant partially undressing, untying corsets, lifting skirts that might weigh 20 pounds or more. She needed help, but not every attendant could be trusted. Gossip moved faster than carriages. A careless glance, a misplaced cloth, a red spot on white sheets, these could spark rumors, even political panic. So queens chose their chambermaids with precision, trained them to silence, and often carried their own silence like a second crown. And yet silence wasn't always an option. When a queen's cycle stopped unexpectedly, doctors were summoned not with urgency but with formality. They didn't ask her how she felt. They inspected her. In France, physicians of the royal court could order vaginal exams to determine if a queen had conceived. But these were not private consultations. Witnesses, always male, were often present. Ministers, secretaries, even ambassadors. Her nakedness, her biology, was not protected by decency, it was owned by the state. The physician might examine the consistency of vaginal discharge, the texture of the cervix, even the smell of her skin to detect signs of pregnancy or disease. All while her husband, or sometimes her enemies, waited nearby for the verdict. This wasn't medicine. It was surveillance. And then came the treatments. For irregular cycles, midwives and court doctors prescribed what they called restoratives, brewed herbs, bleeding, warm compresses to the abdomen, but also mercury, arsenic, and worse. Some queens were given heavy metals or dangerous purgatives under the belief that toxins caused menstrual blockages. In reality, these substances poisoned them slowly. Others were subjected to cupping or leeching ritual bloodletting to balance the humors. A woman who simply suffered from a delayed period could find herself drained, drugged, and dangerously weakened by the very people meant to protect her. And if the bleeding never returned, the whispers would begin. Was she cursed? Had she sinned? Or most damning of all, was she barren? That word barren was a death sentence in a queen's world. It wasn't just about children. It was about worth. About power. A fertile queen held the keys to empire. An infertile one became a liability. Some were quietly set aside, others were divorced. And a few simply disappeared into their chambers, buried in shame while the world forgot their names. One such woman was Queen Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II of England. She suffered multiple miscarriages, endured invasive treatments, and lived in constant fear that her inability to bear a child would lead to her downfall. Charles never produced a legitimate heir, and though Catherine was never cast out officially, she lived under a permanent shadow. Every time her period returned, it marked another failed month. Another lost opportunity. Another reason for the court to turn its eyes toward younger, more fertile prospects. Meanwhile, the gowns remained heavy, the corsets remained tight, and the blood, silent as ever, continued to come. And it wasn't just Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, concubines of the Sultan were inspected for signs of menstruation. A girl who had not yet bled was not considered ready for the harem. A woman whose bleeding stopped without pregnancy might be considered cursed or useless. And in the imperial courts of China, eunuchs were tasked with recording the cycles of imperial consorts, keeping detailed logs of when they bled, when they did not, and what color the blood appeared to be. These records were not for health, they were for power. The emperor's virility, the court's fortune, the succession of an entire dynasty might hinge on one woman's uterine clock. So they watched, they recorded, they judged. And through it all, the women endured. They walked through gold-lined halls wearing cages of silk, their bodies aching, their bellies cramping, their dignity bound by ribbons and duty. They smiled when required. They performed, they bled, but the history books never wrote that part. The gowns are gone now. The palaces have crumbled into museums and wedding venues, their corridors no longer echoing with royal footsteps but with camera shutters and idle chatter. The thrones sit empty, polished, protected, posed under glass. Yet what happened beneath those velvet skirts, in the hush of royal chambers, in the space between the bleeding and the watching, still lingers like a ghost pressed into the walls. Because the truth is, the story of royal blood didn't end with European courts. Across continents and empires, from Ming China to Mughal India, from the Aztec palaces to the pharaoh's inner sanctums, menstrual blood, this silent, essential, forbidden thing, was both feared and revered, hidden and weaponized, worshipped and punished. And always controlled. In some cultures, a woman on her period was seen as untouchable, not with reverence, but with suspicion. In ancient Japan, it was believed that menstrual blood defiled sacred spaces, and women were sometimes forbidden from entering shrines or handling food during their cycles. In Hindu traditions still followed in parts of South Asia today, menstruating women are sometimes asked to sleep separately, eat separately, and avoid religious rituals. But thousands of years ago, in those same lands, blood was once seen as divine. The Vedic text spoke of a woman's power to create life, and some scholars believe menstrual blood was considered one of the 5 sacred substances offered in rituals to the gods. It is not just superstition, it is contradiction, stretching across time, because empires do not build themselves on logic. They build on fear, on silence. And nothing silences a woman faster than making her biology a burden. In medieval Europe, church scholars debated whether Eve's punishment for original sin was menstruation itself. They wrote of the curse of blood, describing it as unclean, impure, even dangerous to crops and animals. This theology seeped into law. In 13th century England, women accused of being witches were sometimes examined for signs of unnatural bleeding. A woman whose cycle had stopped might be accused of harboring the devil. A woman who bled too heavily was suspected of sorcery. And if that same woman bled during a full moon, it was enough to justify execution. The message was clear: your body betrays you, and in doing so, it betrays us all. But what about the women who tried to fight back? Who tried to reclaim control of their bodies in secret? Some created their own remedies, passed down in whispers from mother to daughter. In Renaissance Italy, women would boil mixtures of herbs, rue, pennyroyal, myrrh to regulate or suppress their cycles. These brews were dangerous. Many caused internal bleeding, organ failure, or death. But the alternative was worse: forced pregnancy or accusations of infertility. Others turned to magic. In Eastern Europe, village women crafted talismans out of animal bones and red thread, believing they could tie the womb and stop bleeding on command. These rituals were often performed in silence, under moonlight, surrounded by fear of discovery, fear of failure, fear of themselves. And what happened when the blood simply wouldn't come? When month after month passed in emptiness, and the silence of the womb became deafening. In Tudor England, a noble woman who couldn't conceive might be accused of having a cold womb. Physicians would burn herbs near her thighs, force her to sit over smoke, or even insert heated stones into her bed to warm her uterus. One woman was reportedly told to carry dried wolf liver in her dress at all times. Another was advised to sleep with a frog's heart pressed between her breasts. This was not medicine. This was desperation, dressed in the language of ritual. But even in desperation, some found power. In ancient Egypt, menstruation was not taboo, it was prophecy. High priestesses would collect menstrual blood for rituals, believing it held divine wisdom. In some myths, the Nile's life-giving floods were linked to the blood of goddesses. Papyrus scrolls describe life elixirs derived from women's blood, used in sacred ceremonies to bless pharaohs or consecrate tombs. These practices vanished under Greek and Roman influence, buried by conquest and replaced by shame. But for a moment, there was a time when bleeding was not a curse, it was a crown. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing of all, because when a woman's body holds power, the world tries to contain it. And when that fails, it erases it. Look through your history books. Find the stories of queens who bled and ruled. You won't. You'll find their marriages, their dowries, their heirs. You'll find wars fought in their names, but not their pain, not their blood. Not their quiet, aching strength as they stood before thousands smiling, waving, dying inside. Take Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, as she was known. Idolized for her beauty, she battled anorexia and constant digestive illness, likely exacerbated by the intense menstrual treatments she endured. Her journals speak in riddles of the red tide and the inner storm, but no one around her ever acknowledged the reality. She fainted at banquets, collapsed after hunts. And still, she was praised as the embodiment of grace, or considered Queen Victoria. Her private letters mention excruciating monthly pain, yet her doctors dismissed it as melancholic female disposition. She was given laudanum liquid opium to dull her agony. And still expected to mother 9 children, run an empire, and smile for portraits that would never show the truth. The portraits never do. So much of history has been written by men in rooms far from blood. They documented dates, names, battles, but left the red margins empty. The hidden history of women's pain, of their dignity, of the endless endurance stitched into their bodies, remains locked behind corsets and whispered warnings. But it is there, in every letter where a delay is noted with dread. In every throne that soaked a secret. In every grave that holds a woman who died not in war, but in childbirth, or miscarriage, or from the poisons they were told would save them. Their blood is part of the past. We just weren't taught to see it. And maybe that's why it matters now. Not because we can change what happened, but because we can finally say what did. Because for too long, history has been silent where it should have screamed. And because somewhere, in some forgotten castle chamber, there is a bloodstain that refused to wash out and still waits to be understood.